Phew, this game took me an entire weekend to finish. I got this game on Friday, but my download speed was insanely slow, so I had to wait for tomorrow so that the game is finished downloading. And while I preload Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I decided to spend my empty weekends just to play the living hell out of the new Spider-Man game as it was released early. Without further ado, let's talk about Insomniac Spider-Man, or Marvel Spider-Man, or Spider-Man 2018, or Spider-Man PS4. Christ, this is so confusing. What is it with game developers naming this game just Spider-Man? I can confuse this with the PS1 game, which was pretty awesome, the movie tie-in game, or even the Sega Genesis game. At least add some subtitle to it. Wait a second, the game developer is Insomniac, and Spider-Man doesn't get too much sleep, so... Perfect. Anyway, the Insomniac Spider-Man story is that Peter Parker has been Spider-Man for years, and after stopping Kingpin from doing whatever he was doing, a group of gangs called the Demons began terrorizing the city after the absence of Kingpin's power. Spider-Man had to stop the Demons and figure out their motive, their agenda, and whoever is the one behind all of this. Just a couple of days before the release of the actual game, there has been several hooplas regarding the game suffering from downgrades in the graphical department, but the only comparisons being shown for the downgrades are the lack of puddles, the reflections, the shading, the ambient occlusion both in Spider-Man and the environment in general. But after playing the game for an entire weekend, this game suffers a graphical downgrade that is about as substantial as a black pixel dot in a painting of Mona Lisa. This game looks absolutely beautiful. New York City just looks downright stunning. The game renders the buildings, the skyboxes, the streets, the random clutters on the road very well. There is so much attention to detail on this game. It is one of the most appealing games to look at in PS4, and it certainly has pushed its capabilities because the game suffers from some frame drops at certain cases, and there are some very noticeable texture popping. But the graphics are not the things that make a good game. So can Insomniac offer us the definitive Spider-Man gameplay experience? Can Insomniac make the Arkham Asylum for Spider-Man? In this department, I can confidently say that, ladies and gentlemen, Insomniac kind of succeeded. Okay, maybe not as confident as I thought it would be, but let's talk about the one thing that people want to know the most, the web slinging. The web slinging has always been one of the major selling features in a Spider-Man game because people wanted to know how it feels like web slinging from one part of the city into another. I cannot blame them, especially since the release of Spider-Man 2 on the PS2 and GameCube, which people really like, and having some really good web slinging mechanics. Now, while I have played Spider-Man 2, I don't have too much memories of it. I do have memories of climbing the tallest building in the game, but I think that the game was pretty enjoyable and the web slinging is enjoyable, so I can't really say if the web slinging in Insomniac Spider-Man is as good as Spider-Man 2, but I can definitely say that the web slinging in this game feels awesome. It's not just hold one button and then press another. The game also considers the momentum, the timing, the environment, the places where you can sling your web at. All of this combined creates a visually satisfying web slinging experience. Other than web slinging, you also have many other means of travel, like fast travel, which is fun, but you can also do this thing called web zipping. After zipping to a point, you can also launch yourself to build up speed and momentum. You can even unlock an upgrade where if you time the launch button well, you will launch significantly further. The web slinging on this game does take a bit of time to get used to, but it's the one that requires genuine skill. Thankfully, the game does have tons and tons of challenges that will test your web slinging skills, so they pretty much don't go wasted. Now let's get into the combat. The combat is just as good, but just like the web slinging, it does require a bit of time to get used to. At first, the combat might felt like any other action-adventure games, but once you get a hang of it, you will soon grasp the true feeling of fighting like Spider-Man. There are so many combinations and combat styles and power-ups and gadgets that you can use in the combat. Explaining all of these mechanics are gonna take a while. There are so many tools and combos that you can use. Different enemies are vulnerable to different combos. At first, you might get overwhelmed, but after a couple more combat sessions, you will get the groove of the situation. My biggest problem with the combat is the targeting, which is incredibly awkward. I sometimes want to fire my webs into a certain enemy or pull off certain enemies, but the game points it to someone else that I don't want to. But other than that, the combat for Spider-Man is about as good as a Spider-Man game can get. Combining the beautiful landscape of New York City with the definitive Spider-Man gameplay, and you will get an experience like no other. Insomniac has managed to make a game that truly captures the feeling of being Spider-Man. This is the definitive Spider-Man game that allows lot of Spider-Man fans have asked for years. It is made by people who have clearly taken notes from the failures of the previous Spider-Man games and perfected the formula to make such a well-crafted game. It is a shame that the game is only on PS4, which actually does significantly impact my verdict of this game. You know what else does? The QTEs and the puzzles. The puzzles on this game are utter trash. They are merely pipe dream minigames and pattern matching minigames that would only be more appropriate if you showed them to kindergartners. The QTEs are also pretty terrible, but thankfully they are forgiving. But here's the thing though, the game gives you the option to disable those two things in the accessibility menu, making the garbage QTEs and the puzzles completely optional things to get through. Why would you give people the option to skip QTEs and puzzles if you know very well that they are garbage? It's like a restaurant offering me an optional slap to the face. I mean, you can say no, but the $1,000,000 question here is, why do you even offer that? Some people say that it's for repeated playthroughs, which is understandable. Some people also want to enjoy the story of the game and not get bogged down with 100% completion, which is also understandable. But the thing is, I beat this game in around 20 to 30 hours. So if you want to make the game even shorter, feel free. If you're one of those people who want to just play the game for the story, I want you to leave all of these accessibility settings off and play on the normal difficulty. Even if you are the absolute worst player in a video game, the normal difficulty of the game is way too easy. Sure, there is a harder difficulty option, but I expect to be a bit more challenged in the normal difficulty. In every mission that I encountered, I never died twice. Either I died once or I never died at all. I never even died in the final boss battle, which I won't spoil. And throughout the entire 15 to 20 hour plus gameplay session, I can count the total times I die with both of my hands. And most of them because of those goddamn freaking brutes and a stupid game not aiming my web shots properly. Also, there are times where the game will let you play as other characters like Miles Morales or Mary Jane Watson. There are so many points in the story where the game decided to yank the players off of the controls of Spider-Man to give you mandatory stealth sections playing as either MJ or Miles. These mandatory stealth sections are about as entertaining as trying to sneak your way around Batman while wearing those painfully annoying squeaky shoes. I think it's because stealthing around as Spider-Man isn't as challenging as when you are a normal person with an instant game over when spotted. And yes, by the way, if you want to play stealth as Spider-Man, the game might as well roll the credits because it is also too goddamn easy. It is also pretty damn pointless. There are outpost takeover side missions in the game that allow you to stealth in wave 1, but wave 2 and onwards are gonna be combat anyway, so what's the point? It is also not as satisfying and or challenging as the combat, so as much as I love your combat game, you're still not on the Arkham levels of having fun combat and stealth. Your stealth is just meh, and making it mandatory to certain sections, to certain characters that are significantly weaker than Spider-Man, only add a lot more insult to injury. I think I've talked about the gameplay enough, so now let's talk about another key selling point of the game, which is the story. The story is a bit more complicated to explain. Not that it's a complicating story, it's that if I want to explain it without spoilers, it's gonna be a bit more difficult. That's because there are so many things going on with the plot of the game. There are tons and tons of story threads early on, and all of these story threads eventually connect into one big giant story thread that makes total sense. So what are the story threads? Well, you have Peter Parker helping out May with the humanitarian organization Feast. You have Peter Parker helping Dr. Otto Octavius in his neurological prosthetics project. You have Peter Parker struggling to go back to Mary Jane, and you have the whole demons trying to do villain stuff in Manhattan and the entire New York. All of these story threads got eventually resolved, which is nice, and the story is pretty well structured and well realized. Is the Insomniac Spider-Man story good? Well, the story itself is just fine. What I find very surprising on the story of the game is how well the story handles its characters. All of the major characters in the game are well developed, interesting, and they have vibrant and fun personalities, which most definitely saves the game's story from being just fine to actually pretty good. Peter Parker in this game is very likable. He suffers from a lot of issues. One is his inability of trusting people, one is with his passion with science, one is with his financial issues, and of course his superhero career. The game depicts all of these issues in a manner that is well balanced and adds more to Peter as a character. My favorite one is every single interaction between him and Dr. Octavius, which is proven significant later on in the end. It's the one issue that only adds more layers into not only Peter Parker, but also Dr. Octavius. It reminds me so much of their interactions in Spider-Man 2, which I think is one of the best scenes in the entire film. Mary Jane Watson is also pretty damn enjoyable. I don't know about you, but she looks a lot like Resident Evil The Generation's Claire Redfield, which explains why I find this character to be really pretty. While I enjoyed her depiction here, this is not the MJ that I remembered. Mary Jane Watson acts a lot more like April O'Neil that actually scratch that. Mary Jane Watson in this game is April O'Neil. Fortunately for you, Insomniac, I really like April O'Neil as a character, but slapping Mary Jane Watson's name and likeness in her is not gonna make me forget that she's basically April O'Neil. With the exception of 4 villains that were in there just for the fathers, the villains are surprisingly well developed, as they are developed early on. The major villains in the game do have personal beefs and relationships with Peter Parker himself, and these relationships are the ones that build not just Peter's character, but also the villain's character. The villains are great, and they have good relationships with the heroes. It does its job very well in that regard. So what about the new Spider-Man Miles Morales? Well, Miles Morales had an entire gameplay section dedicated to him, but despite all of that, I find his character to be pretty weak, mostly because we don't really get to see much of him. He does have a really damn good and powerful start, but as soon as he becomes a regular character in the story, he's just sort of there, and that's a shame. I really want to see more of Miles Morales, maybe in the sequel or Into the Spider-Verse. Also, whoever came out with the idea of J. Jonah Jameson having his own podcast in the game should deserve a raise.
Jared, go to commercial, then fire yourself, then rehire yourself before the commercial ends. But no, your job ends by a thread. If I paid you, I'd cut your salary in half.
I'd say that the story is satisfactory enough. It's nothing revolutionary, but it does a good job of what it tries to do. So combining good gameplay and good story, and you got yourself a good game. If you are familiar with not just Spider-Man, but the Marvel Universe as a whole, you might find a bunch of very interesting Easter eggs. I myself have found quite a few that opens up so much potential for future games. The references range from Daredevil to the Avengers. These are the ones that I could find, and they are so much fun to get through, especially if you are a Marvel fan. It is a game that not just celebrates Spider-Man, but also Marvel in general if you hunt down all the bonuses and Easter eggs. The game is quite glitchy at times. There was a weird time in which the game just crashed, which is very odd for a PS4 game, and I think that should be fixed with subsequent patches. There was also a weird glitch that happened once that thankfully I got on video, where I tried to take a selfie as Peter Parker, and then this happened. Enemies also got stuck in certain objects if they are not careful. So let's just put this entire thing on a verdict. I think the Insomniac Spider-Man does a relatively good job at being the Arkham Asylum of Spider-Man in terms of gameplay and enjoyment. Not the stealth though, so better luck next time, Insomniac. The mechanics are skillful, well thought out, intuitive, and the gameplay is challenging and varying. The story was just fine, but thankfully the characters and their development are pretty solid. Now, how would I recommend this game? Well, if you own a PS4, it's not a bad purchase, but I'm not gonna ask you to buy it immediately. If you don't own a PS4, this is not a good system seller. I beat this game in around 20 to 30 hours in its entirety on my weekends, and that already includes hunting pretty much a lot of the collectibles. If you are a fan of Spider-Man and you are willing to spend every little penny on your wallet for anything related to Spider-Man, then why are you even watching this video? You probably already bought the game, or perhaps the entire PS4 just for this game. The fact that this game is only for the PS4 does limit a lot of its audiences. Then again, most of the Spider-Man games are always better suited for the consoles. Let's make sure that dumbed down PC versions never ever happens again.